In the heart of one of South America's largest cities, a quiet park became the center of a terrifying mystery. Victims were found, patterns emerged, and investigators slowly uncovered something that the media barely covered. A psychological profile so complex, it would force an entire nation to rethink how it classified hatred, motive, and justice. This is the story of the Rainbow Maniac. São Paulo, Brazil, a city of over 12 million people, one of the most culturally diverse, economically complex, and socially layered urban environments on the planet. Within this city existed neighborhoods that were historically known as gathering spaces for Brazil's LGBTQ+ community, areas that represented both celebration and vulnerability. In the district of Pinheiros, public parks had long served as community spaces. For decades, people gathered there for leisure, connection, and for many marginalized groups, a rare sense of belonging. But in the mid-2000s, something began to shift. Reports of targeted violence in these open public spaces began surfacing in local news. At first, individual cases were treated as isolated incidents by law enforcement. Victims shared a disturbing commonality. They were gay men who frequented the same park areas. Yet for months, no formal serial investigation was launched. Between 2007 and 2009, a series of targeted shootings occurred in and around public park areas frequented by gay men in the Pinheiros region of São Paulo. The victims were killed with a firearm. Each case on its surface could have been classified as random urban violence, a label tragically common in high-crime Brazilian cities. But community members and local activists noticed the pattern long before authorities officially acknowledged it. They began documenting. They began organizing. They brought their concerns to local media. The response was slow. This is the forgotten chapter in the Rainbow Maniac story. The community itself became the first investigators. Gay rights groups collected testimonies. They mapped incident locations. They observed that the targeting was deliberate and geographically consistent, centered around park areas known as social spaces for gay men. They publicly stated that these were hate crimes. They demanded a serial investigation. Eventually, São Paulo's civil police opened a formal investigation. A suspect emerged from CCTV footage and witness accounts. A man described as ordinary in appearance, employed, and known within his own community. Someone whose exterior gave no indication of the violence being attributed to him. His name would later become synonymous with a national debate about hate crime legislation in Brazil, a debate that had been delayed far too long. When investigators and forensic psychologists began constructing a behavioral profile of the Rainbow Maniac, they encountered a profile that defied simple categorization. The perpetrator, identified as Marcelo Costa de Andrade in some historical accounts, was not acting from a chaotic, disorganized place. Forensic analysts noted a disturbing degree of selection and repetition. The crimes were targeted. The locations were chosen. The victims fit a pattern the perpetrator appeared to be deliberately constructing. This is where psychology enters the story in a crucial way. Criminologists who studied the case pointed to a phenomenon documented in hate-motivated offenders, a dehumanization process that allows a person to frame their violence as something other than violence, as something righteous, cleansing, or ideologically justified. The psychological literature distinguishes between two types of hate-based offenders: those driven purely by opportunistic prejudice, and those operating under a fixed ideological belief system that validates their behavior to themselves. The Rainbow Maniac case appeared to present characteristics of the second category. Forensic experts noted that offenders in this category are often socially functional. They hold jobs, maintain relationships, present normally to the outside world. This functional mask is precisely what makes them most difficult to identify early. Understanding this psychological framework wasn't just academically significant. It would become central to how Brazilian courts and lawmakers approached the prosecution and the legislative aftermath that followed.
The investigation into the Rainbow Maniac became one of São Paulo's most publicly scrutinized criminal inquiries of its decade,
in large part because of how vocally the LGBTQ+ advocacy community pushed for accountability. The unique angle that rarely gets covered in summaries of this case is the role that civil society pressure played in accelerating the investigation. In cities where institutional bias can slow response to crimes against marginalized groups, community-organized pressure campaigns, media advocacy, and documented evidence collection by activists directly shaped the pace and direction of police work. Witness testimonies were compiled. Patterns from park CCTV systems were mapped by investigators, cross-referencing with community-supplied incident logs. A timeline emerged, and within that timeline, a suspect profile solidified.
The arrest, when it came, was significant not only for criminal justice reasons.
It was significant because it represented the first time São Paulo law enforcement formally categorized these crimes as systematically targeted, a categorization that gay rights advocates had demanded from the very beginning. During interrogations, behavioral analysts noted the suspects' responses were consistent with documented profiles of ideologically motivated offenders, individuals who have constructed an internal narrative that distances them from moral accountability. The evidence compiled, forensic, testimonial, and behavioral, built a case that would stand in court. But the more significant battle was just beginning. Not inside a courtroom, but inside the Brazilian legislature. The legal outcome of the Rainbow Maniac case was, in institutional terms, a success. The suspect was convicted. The evidence held. The prosecution presented a coherent and thorough case that the defense could not dismantle. But legal scholars and civil rights advocates highlighted something deeply uncomfortable about how the verdict was framed. Under Brazilian law at the time, there was no specific hate crime statute that explicitly recognized crimes motivated by homophobia as a distinct criminal category, deserving enhanced sentencing consideration. This legal gap meant that the prosecution argued the case on the merits of the individual crimes, not on the underlying ideological motivation that made them part of a pattern. The community that had fought hardest for recognition of these crimes as hate-motivated found that the justice system had delivered a verdict, but had not fully reflected their experience in its legal language.
The uncomfortable truth at the heart of the case. Justice was technically delivered, but structural recognition was still absent. Criminologists who analyzed the case in academic papers following the trial noted that this gap between legal conviction and legal classification is common in jurisdictions without explicit hate crime frameworks. The practical result is that future perpetrators are not deterred by enhanced penalties, and future investigations may not default to pattern recognition when marginalized communities are targeted. The Rainbow Maniac case had exposed a fault line in Brazilian law, and it would take years and considerable advocacy before that fault line was formally addressed. The story of the Rainbow Maniac is not simply a crime story. It is a story about who gets protected by the law, and what happens when a community decides that waiting is no longer acceptable. If this story moved you, share it, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply refuse to let a story be forgotten.